Welcome to part 3 of your third lesson in web design. And in this series, we've been building a fan page. And where we last left off, our page looked like this. So using CSS, we changed the structure of the page so that we have a menu bar at the top with these menu buttons. And so far, they don't do anything. What these buttons will do is they are going to take the tables that you see here in the middle that are blue, and they will hide two of the tables and show one. So if I click on the roster button, it will show only the roster table, and if I were to click on the records button, it will only show the record. So just to give you a visual, this is the finished web page. If I click on record, it switches to the record table. This is the pics table for the slideshow, and then this is the roster. So this is what we're aiming to do by the end of this video. Additionally, what we're going to do is we're going to add functionality for this slideshow that we can click the left and right buttons and view different images. And finally, what we're going to add is a special feature called a modal pop-up window. If I click on this picture, it will zoom full screen, and I can close it as well. So that's what we're going to be doing in this video. Let's go ahead and get started. To get started, I'm going to open up Aptana, and I'm going to find my lesson3.js file. I created this in lesson 1, or part 1 of this video series. If you still need to make this, just click the shortcut button up here and select File, and you're going to name it lesson3.js. I already have it, so I'm going to double click it to open it. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to work on those tables and the buttons in the upper left-hand corner. So we're going to create some variables that are going to refer to this button, and this button. So let's start there. How do we actually reference these in JavaScript? Well, I've demonstrated this in the previous videos, and we're going to do it again. So we're going to start with the keyword var, and that just means variable. And then we can give it any name we want, but usually what I do is if I've got a button, I use the same name. So I've got record button, slideshow button, and roster button here in the HTML. Let's just use those so that we know exactly what we're referring to. So I'm going to say roster button, and I abbreviate button BTN, and I capitalize the B so it stands out. And in order for me to quickly refer to it, I'm going to say document. In other words, go look through the document and get an element by its ID. And this method here is just going to go find it in our HTML as long as I specify the name within parentheses and double quotes. And the name is roster button. So now later on, we can just refer to our roster button as this in JavaScript, not all of that. And it's a little shortcut. So we're going to repeat this again for the slideshow button. So again, I'm going to scan through the document, get the element by its ID, and it's called slideshow button. An important point here to point out is that the names in JavaScript are case sensitive. So something that is uppercase here needs to be uppercase, and something that's lowercase needs to be lowercase. So the final one that we're going to make is record button. Okay, so now each one of these variables, roster button, slideshow button, and record button, are all pointing to these buttons in our web page. So now let's also do the same thing for our tables. Let me shrink this up. We've got the record table, the roster table, and the slideshow table. So we basically need to do the exact same thing to point to those. So I'm going to say var roster TBL. TBL is just an abbreviation for table. And in the document, get element by ID. And I'm going to specify roster table. So that's what it's going to go find. The next one is going to be the slideshow table. Notice how I'm keeping the names consistent. So for instance, the slideshow button points to the slideshow table, and the roster button points to the roster table. Since we get to make up names ourselves, consistency really helps in making the code more readable and easier to follow. And finally, we've got the record table. At this point, we've created 6 variables, 3 of which point to the buttons that are going to be in our menu bar, and 3 of which that point to our tables that are going to be in our main content section. But we're not doing anything with them. So we have to now create a function, which is just a fancy word that means a method, an action to be performed, and then do something with these variables. So let's go ahead and just use the word function, and notice how it pops in blue because it's a keyword of JavaScript. And then we can name our function anything we want. So I'm going to call it button click because this is going to manage what happens when we click a button. And then I'm going to put a set of parentheses. And think of a set of parentheses as just a quick visual reference that this is an action to be performed. Just like up above when we said get element by ID, this is telling the web browser, go do something. In this case, go find an element, and we passed it some information here to say go find that particular element. So we're going to do something similar here with button click. All right, so whenever a button is clicked, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to hide the tables. So we're going to hide all 3 tables, and then depending upon which button is clicked, we'll show that one. So I'm going to say roster table dot style. All right, so I'm going to change its style here in JavaScript, and style. The style properties has a particular property called visibility. And then we're going to give it a value of hidden. All right, so by saying style.visibility equals hidden, we are setting and holding that value as one of its style properties. I'm going to go ahead and copy this part and do the same thing for slideshow table. And just paste in that, and the same thing for record table. All right, I'm going to save it at this point, and let's just test this out. It's when we click one of these buttons, we want the tables to disappear. We have to do one more thing, and that is we're going to add the button click event to these buttons here in the HTML, so it actually runs that function. So in order for that function to be run, we have to tell the button when to run it. So when do we want to run it? We want to run it on a click. So right after type equals button, I'm going to add an attribute called onClick, and I'm going to say equals, and between double quotes, I'm going to use the name of the method. The name of the method was button click, and a set of parentheses. All right, so I'm going to copy this attribute to the other 2 buttons so they all use the same method. And then I'm going to save it, and I'm going to launch it. All right, so let's see if these buttons will hide the 3 tables. All right, so I just clicked this, and they all disappeared. So far, we know that our code is working. We know that our variables are pointing to the buttons, the tables are pointing to the tables, and the click event is now wired up. It's now linked with these buttons in our HTML. Now, if we want to show a particular table, let's pass a little information to that function. So in between the parentheses here, I'm going to add a little bit of information, and I'm making up what I'm sending it. I'm just going to say show record table. And in between this one, in between those parentheses, I'm going to say show slideshow table. And in between these parentheses, I'm going to put the single quotes and say show roster table. All right, this is just kind of indicating to me what information I want it to send. So basically, it's going to hide those three tables, but then we'll turn around and change the style property so that it doesn't hide that particular table. Another important point I should point out here is you can't mix and match the double quotes and single quotes. So here I have double quotes on the outside, and on the inside I have single quotes. And I couldn't, for instance, do this. This would be mixing and matching. If I have a single quote here, I have to have a matching single quote over here. And the same thing is true on the outside. If I change that to a single quote, it would basically link together these two instead of the final one. So be very, very careful that you're using matching double or matching single quotes when you're creating these. All right, so let me go ahead and go back to the JavaScript file, lesson3.js, and now we're going to examine what kind of information is being sent to this function. And we're going to do that with a switch. So we're going to say switch, and the messages that are sent to this function are called arguments. So I'm going to say arguments, and we're only getting one argument, which is going to be argument 0. In computer terms, counting generally starts at 0. So the first argument in our list of arguments is element 0. So that's referring to the first one. And there's always only going to be one. So in this case, I'm going to say case show roster table. All right, so if that's the case, then here's what I want to do. And I'm going to put this on the next line. I'm going to say roster table dot style dot visibility, and I'm just going to put 2 double quotes. And what that does is that just changes the hidden to no longer being hidden. It basically resets it. And then I'm going to use another keyword called break. All right, with this template, I'm basically going to copy this 2 more times because I have 2 more tables. All right, so in the second case, I don't want the roster table anymore. I want show slideshow table. And I'm going to copy this to right there. And the third one is going to be the record table. And I'm going to copy this to right there. All right, by default though, I'm going to put in just in case I modify this web page later on, I want to have a default case. But right now I don't plan on doing anything, so this little case is going to do nothing. All right, let's go ahead and save this and run the page. All right, so now I see all 3 of these tables. If I click one of these buttons, that's much better. Here, I'm just seeing the roster table. Let's click picks. And this shows the picks table, and this shows the record table. Okay, so these buttons are working exactly the way we want them to work. It's just showing one table and hiding the other 3. Okay, next up, let's focus on this slideshow table and put an image inside of this picture box. Let's first examine how this table was built in the HTML. So let's go back to Aptana, and here is the table. So this is the container of that little slideshow. And inside of it, we've got a button, and here's another button. And each one has an ID. This one is the left button, and this one is the right button. And in between, we had an image tag, and we gave that an ID of pick. So we're going to do basically the same thing we did with these variables. We're just going to make variables that point to those three things. So here I'm just going to add a little bit of space, and I'm going to say the keyword var. And let's start with we'll just move from left to right. So we have the left button, and I'm going to say the left button is going to hold the value of document.getElementById. And it's going to go find left button. And then we had a pick in between. So I'm going to scan through the document again, get element by ID, and find pick. And then finally, we've got the right button. And we're going to scan through the document and get element by ID. And it's looking for the right button. So very simply, this is just going to point to those three things. Now, another thing that we're going to need is a list of images. So I had on Schoology in part 2, you download the CAVS 1, CAVS 2, and CAVS 3 images. So let's make a little list of those images, and I'll call it pictures. So var pictures, and notice how I'm making this plural because it's a list. So that's another thing that I want to point out here. And this list is going to hold, and I'm using square brackets here. Square brackets is the same key on the keyboard as the curly braces. And in between these, I can put the names of the images. So in between double quotes, I'm going to say images slash cavs1.jpg, and the next one is going to be images slash cavs2.jpg, and then I have a third one, images slash cavs3.jpg. And then I'm going to finish up with a semicolon at the very end. Now, I need to keep track of which picture I am displaying. So I'm going to call this my pick index. And like I said earlier, computers always start at 0. So I'm going to say the pick index is 0 instead of 1. And that basically means we're showing this picture first. And then this would be a value of 1, and this would be a value of 2. So instead of counting 1, 2, and 3, it counts 0, 1, 2. And now we've finished creating 5 additional variables for our web page. Each of these variables simply exists, and it points to parts of our web page. If I go over here, I should be able to find left button and pick and right button. And that's exactly what these three right here do. It just goes and finds them, and it's a reference to that part of the web page. These two right here point to files. So this pictures variable is a list of file names that we will later refer to. And this will keep track of which file we want to show. So now let's use these variables, and the way that we did that up above with the buttons and the tables was we created a function. So the word function just means it's a method, it's an action to be performed. And we can name it whatever we want, whatever makes sense. And since I want to load in a picture, I'm going to call the name of this function loadPick. And the curly braces just indicate that's the beginning, and this is the end of this action. So in between, I'm going to put the actions that I want performed. In this case, I want to take my pick variable, which refers to an image tag on our web page. Here it is. Here's the image tag that has an ID of pick. And I want to change its source attribute. That's this right here. The source attribute, src, points to an image file. And right now it's empty. That's why it didn't display anything. So if I go over here and I say pic.src and then give it an image reference, for instance, if I just copy and paste this one right here, it's going to show that image whenever this method is run. So let's run this method. So this method actually doesn't get run until we call it. And the way that we call it is we just use the name of the method somewhere in our code. So if I just typed load pic right here, what's going to happen is the computer is going to load all of this in. It will remember this function at this point, and then right here it says, oh, you want me to actually run it? I'll do that for you, and it will go back here and run this little block of code right there. And then it's going to continue on, and it's going to see this and say, oh, okay, I'll remember this for whenever a button gets clicked. So far that's what our page does. Let's go ahead and run it and test it. So here you can see the image finally shows up. Remember that when we click our buttons up here, that's when the other tables will disappear. So I'll just click the Pics button so you can see it by itself. And let's go ahead and add the functionality for the left button click and the right button click. So let's do that next. Now, since we intend on having our images change and vary in our slideshow, we can't leave this as always being the cavs1 image. So we're going to have to delete this. And we're going to have to replace it with a variable that can change. So how do we do that? Well, we have a list of pictures here. So we'll just say pictures, and in between square brackets, we'll put our variable that is going to change, called picIndex. And picIndex represents the number or the index of this list that we want to display. So if it's image 0, that's the first one. If it's image 1, it'll display this. And if it's image 2, it'll be this. Because remember, the counting begins at 0, not 1. All right, so this is going to allow us to show a different picture when we click our buttons. All right, let's go ahead and now add that functionality to our buttons that when they get clicked, it will change this number right here. All right, so we're going to begin right after load pic and add a click event. Now, previously in the roster, slideshow, and record buttons over in the HTML, we just added an attribute that's called onClick. And that's one way that we can link our JavaScript and our HTML together, but there is a second way. So I'm going to show you the second way right now. We can use the variable up above called left button and say dot on click. So when I start to type this, you'll see it pop up, so I'm going to go ahead and use it. And this is the same as me going over into the HTML and putting in onClick attribute into it. And I'm going to then say that the onClick is going to equal a function. In other words, it's going to do an action. And here's the action it's going to do every time there is a button click. Now, I do, at the end of these curly braces, need to put a semicolon because this is one complete statement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the number of picIndex. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to say, is the picIndex triple equals 0? So is picIndex 0? And I'm asking that question. So notice the little question mark right here. And if it is, I'm going to do something. And if it's not, I'm going to do something else. And I'm going to separate those two possibilities by a colon. So I'm going to say pictures.length minus 1. And then there's the colon. Otherwise, I want the picIndex minus 1. So if the picture index is 0, do this, and if it's not, do this. What does this all mean? Well, this says, look at how many pictures I have. The length property is 1, 2, 3. So it says I've got 3 images. So if I subtract 1, basically this would be a value of 2. And that would make pick index equal 2. So this means display the cabs 3 image. And if it's not equal to 0, for instance, if pick index is 1, then I'm going to subtract 1 from pick index. So that's what this line does. And immediately following that, I want to load the pick. So I'm just going to say load pick semicolon. All right, so let's try this out and see if we can now use the left button to switch images. So I'm going to go over to my HTML and run it. And I'm going to click on the picks button, and then I'm going to click on the left button. And here you can see it's cycling through some images, but there is an error in here. So let's take a look at what that error is. Okay, this is a relatively easy error to spot. Take a look at the files here. I have cavs1.jpg, cavs2.jpg, and the third one is .png. So the error is that I have JPEG here when I should say PNG. So let's go ahead and try that again. I'm going to go back over to HTML, push play. Let's see this by itself, and then I'm going to click this button. And here you can see it cycling through those pictures. So now we're going to do the same thing for the right button, which now doesn't have anything linked to it. So let's go ahead and shrink this down and go back to our lesson3.js. And basically we're going to just copy this, paste it below, and I'm going to change this to the right button right here. And I'm going to switch a few things around. So if the right button is clicked, instead of looking to see if we have decremented down to 0, I'm going to see if pick index triple equals pictures dot length -1. So basically, if we're on picture number 2, I want it to loop back to pick index 0. So if pick index is already up to 2, that's the end of our list. I can go ahead and make it 0. Otherwise, I can then add 1 to pick index. All right, let's go ahead and save that and run it in our web page. So again, I'm going to click on the picks button just to see our slideshow by itself. And here I can go to the right and I can go to the left. Okay, finally, we want to be able to click on the picture itself and zoom in on it. In order to do that, we need a modal pop-up window. So let me show you how you can create that. For this next part of our video, you're going to need to go back to Schoology, and in our Web Design Tools folder, find the link that says W3 Schools How-To page. And I'm going to open this up in a new tab, and it's going to take us to w3schools.com/how-to. What this web page is useful for is it has a number of really nice features like how to create an animated button, how to integrate Google Maps, how to create drop downs like this as a menu, or create JavaScript animations, add a loader to your page, all kinds of stuff. This is one of my favorites, is the full screen overlay navigation, like a slide down or a slide right. The one that we're going to highlight in our web page is a Modal Box, and here you can preview it by clicking this button. Basically, it's going to gray out the rest of the page, and then we can put content inside of it. What we're using this for over here is when we click on this image, it's going to go full screen. So that's how we're going to modify this tutorial. So let's go ahead and close this and click on Learn How To. So it's going to outline in several steps. Here's step 1, we're going to add some HTML. Step 2, we're going to add some CSS. And in step 3, we're going to add some JavaScript. And here's how we can customize it to add a header and a footer if we want. And here's the CSS necessary to achieve that. So let's just follow steps 1, 2, and 3. Let's add the HTML. So we're just going to basically copy their HTML and modify it to our needs. So I'm going to go click on Aptana, and right below our div tag and right before our script tags, I'm going to go ahead and paste in that HTML. And I'm going to highlight this and tab it over so that it fits with the rest of our formatting. And now we can return to the how-to web page and do step 2. So in step 2, we need to add the CSS. So I'm going to go ahead and copy all of this, and I'm going to return to Aptana. And we made a special file for this earlier just to keep this CSS separate from our custom CSS. So I'm going to go ahead and paste this in a separate file and click Save. And let's check out step 3. So step 3 says add the JavaScript. So here I'm going to go ahead and just copy all of this. And notice the green comments tells you what it's doing. And I created a modal.js file. Let's go ahead and paste that in here. All right, let me save everything at this point. And we have to make a couple of modifications to this. All right, over in the HTML file, we're saying that the trigger is an ID called myButton. Well, we don't want it to be myButton. Let's just take this out altogether. All right, we won't need that. We're going to actually make the trigger the clicking of our picture. So I can clean up the extra space here and click Save. Next, let's go over to the modal.js file. And we want to change that trigger, the button. Here it is. It says get the button that opens the modal. It's not my button, it's going to be pick. All right, so that's another change that we're going to make. Let's test this at this point and see what it does. I'm going to go back to my HTML file, click play, and I'm going to click on this image right here. And here it says some text in the modal. So the modal pops up, but it's not displaying the image. For that, we're going to have to put in an HTML tag and then add a couple more things into our JavaScript. Okay, so let's go back to Aptana. And basically what we need to do here is, here's what the modal displays. Instead of that, what we want is an image tag. So let's go ahead and display an image with img. We'll set an ID so that we can change this image in our JavaScript, and let's just call it our zoom image, zoom img. And right now we'll set the source to be just empty double quotes, and we'll set its alternate display text to go Cavs. And that's a self-closing tag, so we'll just add a slash there. All right, so now it's going to display an image, but right now we don't have anything in the image. To change that, let's go back to our custom lesson3.js file and add a few things. So we basically need to add two things in here to get this to work. We need a reference to the zoom image over in our HTML. And let's just group this with these variables since they're related. So right beneath right button, let's make another variable for zoom image. And I'm going to have it point to the place in the document where it can find an element by ID called zoom image. All right, so that refers to it. And basically we're going to do this line. So let me just copy this. And every time an image is loaded, we're going to synchronize these two images. So I'm just going to replace this with zoom image, and these two images will always be basically the same thing. So let's go ahead and test out how this works. I'm going to go ahead and go over to HTML, push play, and I'm going to click on this image, and it zooms in. I'm going to go to the next image, click on it, it zooms in, and the third image, if I click on that, it zooms in. All right, so it's working just as intended. Now, the final thing that we need to do is we only want one of these images to be displayed when the page is first loaded. So when we load in this page, I'm going to go ahead and just reload. You can also click refresh. It's still stacking all of these tables on top of one another. So let's change that. And close this out. And I'm going to go over to lesson3.js. And we hid our tables using the button click. So we can reuse this function right here if we just call it by default. So it's a good idea to declare your functions first and then use them. So I'm going to put my call to the function underneath it, button click, and if I just use it like this, it should hide all the tables. Let me go ahead and click save, run it again, and here you can see all the tables are hidden. I can see them if I click these buttons. Now, probably what we want from the start is to have at least one of them showing. So I'm going to make the record table show by default. The way that I can do that is back in my lesson 3. Basically, if we're not sending any extra information, like here we're just making a generic call to button click, and we're not saying show the roster table or show the slideshow table, let's just show the record table by default. So I can just take away this right here, and it's going to do this for both cases. In the case of show record table or the default, we're going to do that. And I'm actually going to make one more move here, and I'm just going to use my Alt and down arrow to move this down a line. On the Mac, I believe that's Option and a down arrow. But basically, I just want to move this down below. So in this case or the default case, it's going to run this. So let me go ahead and save it and run it. All right, so here we have one table shown by default, and that's the record table. I could go to the picks table and the roster table as well. And everything is now built and works. All right, so let's go ahead and show how to turn this in. So now we're going to return to Aptana, and I'm going to select my Lesson 3 folder here. So here it's highlighted blue. I'm going to right-click on it and say Show in Windows Explorer. And on a Mac, you're going to say Show in Finder. So we're going to click on that, and it's going to take us to on the hard drive where it's being stored. And I'm just going to simply right-click on Lesson 3 and say Send to Compressed Zip Folder. On a Mac, you would just right-click and say Compress. And when it does that, we're going to rename Lesson 3 with your last name. All right, so put your last name here. If there's 2 people in the class with the same last name, then include your first name. But really all I need is your last name, and we're going to upload this file to Schoology. So then go to Schoology and go to your Lesson 3 folder, locate where it says your Lesson 3 fan page assignment, and click the Submit button, and you're going to submit this file. So you may find it easier if you drag this to your desktop to find it rather than drilling down to, for instance, your Aptana workspace and wherever it is. So just move this file to where you can get it easily and upload it to Schoology from there. When you're all done, you can now take the Part 3 video quiz, and you'll be ready for your next web design lesson.